Human beings are born with needs, biological needs. We know that we need water, we need sleep, we need vitamins, we need nutrients, we need protein, right? Sexual needs, the list goes on, right? We know what these needs are, and we also know how to satisfy them. But we also have psychological needs, right? The needs of the mind, psychological needs. And the psychology field has only just begun to scratch the surface to discover what those needs are or how to satisfy them. We don't really know, we can't say for sure what our psychological needs are. This is why we always struggle with our own nature, right? Our psychological needs are not necessarily known. We're figuring it out as we go along. This is why we wrestle with ourselves, right? We can't let things be or let it go because we don't really know what we want or how to satisfy these psychological needs, right? There's people that are unhappy because they're not happy 24/7, as if they need to be happy 24/7, right? See, this attachment to high self-esteem or low self-esteem, they're both perversions of the mind. Wanting to have a high self-esteem or a low self-esteem are both perversions of the mind, right? Why are they perversions of the mind? Self-esteem is not permanent. Let me say that again. Self-esteem is not permanent. Having a high self-esteem or a low self-esteem is not permanent. Why? Because nobody walks on water, right? Nobody's perfect, right? You're not always going to have high self-esteem, right? It's not something that once you have that you can just, it's not an object, right? Having a high self-esteem is not an object that you can just grab and say, oh, I have high self-esteem now, right? I hope I don't lose it, right? It's not something that you could just put in a box. It's not a cookie cutter. You can't just objectify self-esteem that way, right? There are going to be days where you feel like a monster, okay? And then there's other days you're going to feel like you can do no harm, right? Like you're angelic, right? Your self-esteem is going to fluctuate. It's this attachment that people have where I only want the high self-esteem or I can only have the low self-esteem, right? Both are perversions of the mind, okay? There's something to be said where, let's say you do have high self-esteem all the time, right? And that's your goal. You're one-dimensional. Your self-esteem is high all the time, right? And you always get perfect outcomes. All your desires come true. Everything's rainbows and butterflies. This is the problem with that. There's no growth in that. There's no growth in always having high self-esteem where everything always goes your way. If everything goes your way, there's no growth happening, right? Your comfort level, or your comfort zone, I should say, is attached to your self-esteem on a certain degree, right? A person with high self-esteem, right, is comfortable. That means they're on their comfort zone. Let me say that again. A person with high self-esteem is comfortable. They're in their comfort zone, right? Now, there's no growth in your comfort zone. If you step out of your comfort zone, right, and you get dirty and you get messy and you let your ego get bruised a little bit, you make some mistakes, right? You fail a couple of times, and you will see that your self-esteem is going to fluctuate. All right? Take some punches, right? Take some punches, play around with your ego and see if your self-esteem doesn't fluctuate when you step out of your comfort zone. All right? You have to move the needle. You have to move the needle in the right direction in order for you to grow. But if you're always on high self-esteem mode, right, and you're always on your comfort level, that doesn't happen. All right? Self-esteem is automatic, right? You really don't need permission from anybody to have self-esteem. It's a self-imposed judgment, right? Your self-esteem is a self-imposed measuring stick, right? We all have a measuring stick that we impose on ourselves, And if we meet the criteria, then we have high self-esteem. And if we don't meet the criteria, then we have low self-esteem. But this measuring stick that we all impose on ourselves is somewhat automatic. It comes from a judgment that we have from ourselves, right? It's involuntary, right? It just happens. You don't need to give yourself marching orders to do that. It just happens, right? We have a criteria. We either meet it or we don't. So in a way, we all have a psychological straitjacket, right? We're always judging ourselves and imposing these standards on our own psyche, right? And like I said, this attachment to always wanting high self-esteem, or this attachment of always having low self-esteem, they're both perversions of the mind, okay? They're both perversions of the mind. It's not having high self-esteem or low self-esteem that's the focal point. It's self-acceptance, right? A lot of people confuse having high self-esteem with self-acceptance, and those are two very different things, right? What most people really want is just self-acceptance. It's not having high self-esteem, it's just self-acceptance. Self-acceptance happens regardless of whether you have low self-esteem or high self-esteem. Because like I said, your self-esteem is going to fluctuate. Some days you're going to feel like a monster. Some days you're going to feel angelic, like you can do no harm, right? It's going to fluctuate, and that's okay. It's self-acceptance that we need, not necessarily high self-esteem all the time. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a difference between self-acceptance and self-esteem. Self-acceptance actually takes work, right? It takes work, it takes effort, which is why a lot of people don't have it, right? Whereas self-esteem just it's automatic, right? We judge ourselves. It's very easy to just look in the mirror and judge ourselves, right? We're wired that way. Our emotional circuitry is based on judgment. We're just gonna judge ourselves. Self-acceptance takes work, right? Self-esteem is almost involuntary. We're always judging ourselves. Self-acceptance is a whole different ballgame, right? This is why some people get plastic surgery and they temporarily get high self-esteem until they want to get surgery for something else because they're not content, right? The problem is not the high self-esteem that they temporarily had. It's the judgment. The judgment is what makes someone say, I need to change this about myself, when it's not grounded in any healthy boundaries. It's just, I hope if I change this, I'm gonna have high self-esteem, right? When what they're really looking for is just self-acceptance, right? As long as there's continuous judgment on ourselves, we're always gonna be wrestling with ourselves. As long as we keep judging ourselves, we're always gonna wrestle with ourselves, right? The self-esteem, whether it's low or high, comes from a judgment, right? As long as there's judgment, we're always gonna wrestle with ourselves. There's always gonna be an internal spiritual battle, right? And we're confused. Most of the people are confused. What we really want is acceptance. With acceptance, there's no judgment, right? You just accept yourself. You observe it. You observe yourself without judgment. You sit on it and you just let it be, right? Self-acceptance is just seeing it and putting it in its place, right? You just see it and you let it be. You put it in its place, you sit on it, and that's it. There's no judgment. It is what it is, right? It just is what it is. There's no judgment at all. We're the only species, right? Human beings are the only species where we judge ourselves and other humans, right? Humans judging other humans. You don't really see this in the animal kingdom, right? Like if you go to the zoo, for example, and you're looking at the animals, they're not really judging you, right? What they do is they just observe, right? And so do we. We just go to observe the animals, right? We're not looking at, donkeys and monkeys and elephants and giraffes and zebras thinking, oh, I wonder what that zebra's thinking about me, right? They're not thinking about you. They might look at you and make eye contact, but they're just observing you the same way you observe them, right? It's only in humans when you see another human that you think, well, what are they thinking about me? Or you start thinking about them, right? You don't really see them for what they are. You don't observe them. What you're doing is you're judging them. We're the only species that does that, right? If you've ever been camping, you go camping where there's wildlife, right? Where there's bears around, where there's bears, raccoons, moose, whatever the case may be. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are, right? When you're camping, the bear doesn't care who you are. And you don't really care who the bear is either. You're just observing each other because it's linked to your survival, right? You're camping and it's linked to your survival. You don't want any accident. You don't want to get into a fight with these wild animals, right? There's no judgment. It's just you observe them, right? Like I heard, I'm a huge fight fan, right? And you always hear people in relationships saying, "Oh, you don't pay enough attention, right? You don't give me enough attention, right? You don't pay enough attention to me, right?" You'll never pay more attention to somebody than when you're in a fight with them, right? When you're in a fight with them, you're going to give that person or that animal or whoever you're fighting in a physical fight your undivided attention because it's linked to your survival, right? You observe, you watch them like a hawk, right? There's no judgment. It just happens so fast, right? You just observe, right? But as humans, we always contaminate these interactions with people with judgment. Not just with them, but with ourselves. As long as there's judgment, there's always going to be a self-imposed measuring stick where we're constantly trying to get a high self-esteem or we feel stuck in a low self-esteem. It's not judgment, it's acceptance. You just accept it and you see it for what it is, right? Huge difference. At the end of the day, it is what it is. It's going to be what it's going to be. And that's life.